How you doing, eh? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Yud Gimel, Daf 13, on Masechtas Zevachim. Friends, this is the first Babble of the new year, huh? Hopefully it'll be a good one. Daf 13 has three sections. The first being Lo Lishmah. What keeps flying around over here? There's like stuff flying around, even though I don't think that they're like flies or anything. I just don't know what's moving. What is that? It must be some kind of a fly. Ah, dang it. Lo lishmah during kabolas hadam. All right, so we start off today's Daf Yud Gimel, with a Mishnah. An interesting Mishnah, a Mishnah that's already been quoted from Daf Beis already. This Mishnah, talking about lishmah. This Mishnah also for the first time explicitly calls out shchita, kabbalah, olacha, zrika. And then the first section of the Gemara then discusses lo lishmah during kabolas hadam. So we have a look dafka at kabolas hadam. That's the first section. And then we define Pigul a bit. We kind of transition, I'd say, even for the rest of the daf and beyond. It feels like almost like the Pandora's box has been opened almost in some ways regarding Pigul. I think we haven't really talked much about Pigul yet. We've been focused mainly on lishmah, shinui bailin, shinui kodesh. Now we kind of open up the cover of Pigul in some ways, and we get some interesting definitions of Pigul, which is great. And finally, we discuss dipping a finger into the blood of a korbin chatas and how that relates to Pigul. So, very interesting stuff today. So we kind of get like a new kind of angle over here. We kind of open up, kind of expanding in some ways, Masechta Zevachim, opening up Pigul and different parts of the offering of the korbin, instead of just kind of focusing on the lishmah and kind of shrita kind of stuff. We're really going into the other avodas as well. So chevra, that is what we have in store for Daf Yud Gimel. It's going to be great. Let us do this. Yud Gimel, of course, is gematria of ahava, of love, and echad, and one. So good daf. Friends, we begin on Daf Yud Gimel, Amid Aleph 2, 4, 6 lines. 2, 4, 6 lines into Daf Yud Gimel, Amid Aleph, at the Mishnah. Ha-Pesach ve'achatas, a korbin Pesach, korbin chatas. Of course, those are the two korbanis that are pasul shelo lishmo. Sheshchaten shelo lishmon, that they were slaughtered shelo lishmon. Kibel, kabolas hadam, v'holach, holachas hadam, v'zarak, zrikas hadam, shelo lishmon. If you've done any of the avodas, not just the shchita, but shchita, kabbalah, holacha, zrika, shelo lishmon, or lishman v'shelo lishman, maybe you remember this from Daf Beis, or lishman and shelo lishman. So like, let's say you're doing shchita, so let's say the beginning of the shchita is lishman, and then by the end of the slice, you're already thinking shelo lishman. And we're going to explain what that means in practice. Oh, shelo lishman v'lishman, psulin, pasul. Ketzad lishman v'shelo lishman. How so? Give me a practical, real-world example of lishman v'shelo lishman, l'shem pesach v'l'shem shlomim. That's a practical, real-world example. A person, let's say Aharon, is slaughtering Reuven's korbin Pesach, and initially his kavana is for a korbin Pesach, but by the end of the shechita already he's thinking about a korbin shlomim. Shelo lishman v'lishman, l'shem shlomim, l'shem Pesach. And shelo lishman v'lishman would simply be the opposite. That at the beginning of shechita, Aharon's thinking about a shlomim, but by the end of the shechita, he's already thinking about a korbin Pesach. Those are going to be pasul. She'azevach nifsol be'arba dvarim, because a korbin, dafka a zevach. A korbin could also be a korbin mincha, other things, but a zevach, an animal sacrifice, could become pasul by any of these four avodas: b'shchita, v'kibul, v'hiluch, v'zrika. By shchita, kabolas hadam, holachas hadam, zrikas hadam. By any of those avodas, if there's a machshavas shelo lishmah, the korbin will be possible. Reb Shimon machshir behiluch. Oh, so this is going to be we're going to discuss this. I don't think so much today, or maybe by tomorrow already we start talking about it, but certainly in 2 days' time. Anyways, this is going to be a bit of a discussion. Reb Shimon's understanding, Reb Shimon's opinion, but says Reb Shimon's interesting opinion. Machshir behiluch shaya omer, because Reb Shimon would say, I efshir shelo b'shchita, v'shelo b'kabola, v'shelo b'zrika, aval efshir b'lo hiluch. So says Reb Shimon something very interesting. So Reb Shimon says, look, a machshavas shelo lishma by holachas hadam will not ruin, will not passel the korbin. The reason being that, technically speaking, you don't need to do holachas hadam. It's possible to have a kosher korbin without holachas hadam. How so? Well, if you slaughter the korbin right next to the mizbeach, then you don't need to take it to the mizbeach. It's already at the mizbeach. So shchita, yeah, obviously you can't have a korbin without shchita. And then you have to do kabolas hadam. You have to do kabolas hadam. You have to do zrikas hadam. Holachas hadam, if the animal's already there, you don't technically have to do it. So therefore, Shimon says that because holachas hadam is not inherently an avoda that must be done, unlike shchita, kabola, zrika. So therefore, a machshavas shelo lishma by holacha, according to Reb Shimon, is kosher. Let's read that again. Reb Shimon machshir behiluch. Reb Shimon would say a machshavas shelo lishma by holachas hadam is taka kosher. Shoya omer, because he would say, I efshir shelo b'shchita, you have to do shchita. V'shelo b'kabala, you have to do kabalas hadam. V'shelo b'zrika, you have to do zrikas hadam. Aval efshir below hiluch. But it's efshir, it's possible to have a korbin without doing any holachas hadam at all. For example, if you shech the korbin right next to the mizbeach, you don't have to take the blood anywhere, and that would be completely fine. So because inherently holachas hadam is something that doesn't need to be done, a machshavas shelo lishma by holachas hadam is not going to passel the korbin. Rabbi Elazar says, Rabbi Elazar, mahalich b'makom shu tzorich lalich machshavas machshava poseles b'makom she'eino tzorich lalich in machshava poseles. So Rabbi Elazar says Rabbi Elazar that a person who walks in a place where he needs to walk, so then it's going to be possible. But in a place where it doesn't need to walk, so then it won't be possible. Meaning, right, so when are we going to talk? I think this will probably be tomorrow's daf. Interesting. Who is it? Is this the Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon? What is the... Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon. I didn't really... Okay, I got it. Okay, this is the sheet of Rabbi Elazar. I see. Okay, this makes a little more sense now. Okay, this is after the sheet of not Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua, but rather Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon. Okay, so it says Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon, so it depends. If we're talking about a scenario, and this is going to come up more tomorrow, but if we're talking about a scenario where you must walk, there's no way around it. You have to do holachas hadam. So then holacha, so meaning Reb Shimon's whole thing was that since you don't have to do holachas hadam, so therefore machshavas shelo lishma is not going to ruin the korbin by holachas hadam. However, says Rabbi Elazar, he gets a little bit more into details. He says it depends. If we're talking about a scenario where you have to do holachas hadam, there's no way around it. And again, we'll discuss this more tomorrow. So if you have to do holachas hadam, so then machshavas shelo lishma is going to ruin the korbin. In a scenario where you don't have to do holachas hadam, so then machshavas shelo lishma will not ruin the korbin, and we will again discuss this in more detail tomorrow. So now says the Gemara, the kabola mi posla. So says the Gemara, is kabolas hadam really going to ruin the korbin? So if a Haran, let's say, does shchita, and now I imagine he probably will be unable to do kabolas hadam on his own shchita. So now you have another korbin, let's say. Now you have another kohen, let's say, and that kohen is doing kabolas hadam, putting a vessel underneath the neck of the animal, and the animal is bleeding out into this vessel that is beneath its neck. So the question is, so we had said in our Mishnah that by all the four avodos, shchita, kabbalah, holacha, zrika, machsheves shelo lishmah is going to ruin the korbin. The Gemara is questioning that with as relates to kabolas hadam. Will machsheves shelo lishmah really ruin a korbin, passel a korbin, when the machsheves shelo lishmah is by kabolas hadam? But after all, what about the following? Brisa v'krivu zo kabolas hadam. Okay, fine. When the pasuk says v'krivu b'nei Aaron hakohanim as hadam, etc. So zo kabolas hadam. This is a reference to kabolas hadam. Atomer kabolas hadam. We know it's zrika. Wait, how do we know it's kabolas hadam? Maybe it's zrikas hadam. Kishu omer v'zarku. How is zrika omer? The same pasuk. If I'm going to read the pasuk, it says v'krivu b'nei Aaron hakohanim hadam v'zarku as hadam on mizbech sav, etc. So when the pasuk immediately afterwards says v'zarku, how is zrika omer? That's v'zarku is obviously zrikas hadam. Amanim kaim v'krivu. So what's v'krivu? So kabolas hadam. Okay, it's kabolas hadam. Azoi. B'nei Aaron hakohanim. When the pasuk says, right, when it says v'krivu b'nei Aaron hakohanim, shetehei b'choyin kosher v'chlei sharis. B'nei Aaron hakohanim. What we learn from there is that the kabolas hadam must be, and I guess the zrikas hadam maybe also, must be with a kohen kosher, as opposed to a cholol or a balmum, says Rashi. It has to be a kohen kosher. And wearing the klei sharis, in this case, what klei sharis is reference to is the big day kahuna. So let's say if we're talking about a kohen hedjit, we're talking about the 4 big day kahuna. Okay, so b'nei Aaron hakohanim today, the kohen kosher v'klei sharis, that the avodah should be done with a kosher kohen wearing the vestiges. What's a vestige? Is that like a garment? Wearing the proper attire, the proper garb of a kohen. Rabbi Akiva learns out the kohen and garb thing from a different place. Rabbi Akiva minayin the Kabbalah shalete ela b'kohen kosher v'chlei sharis. How do we know that kabolas hadam must be kabolas hadamd by a kosher kohen wearing proper kohanic, proper priestly garb? Shneimar kan b'nei Aharon. Well, because over here it says b'nei Aharon v'neimar l'holen eile shmos b'nei Aharon hakohanim ha'meshuchim. And there's another pasuk that says eile shmos b'nei Aharon hakohanim ha'meshuchim, and there asher milei yodam l'chayin. Right, the pasuk says asher milei yodam l'chayin. Milei yodam is a reference to wearing the proper garb, and also in that context, it talks about Elazar and Isamar, B'nei Aharon. So we're talking about kosher Kohens wearing proper priestly garb. So malaholim b'kohen kosher v'chlei sharis. So just like in that, by that pasuk, it's talking about kohen kosher and klei sharis avkan. So here also by kabolas hadam, we're talking about b'kohen kosher v'chlei sharis. Reb Tarfon says, Reb Tarfon, akapeach es bonai. That's a very extreme statement by Reb Tarfon. He says, I will bury my sons im lo shamati lehav. It's like here, like I could have sworn that I heard im lo shamati lehavchin hefresh ben kabbalah lezrika. Reb Tarfon says, I could have sworn that I once heard about a distinction between kabolas hadam and zrikas hadam. Although he says, not just I could have sworn, but he says it in a sort of very dramatic phrase. He says, akapeach es bonai, I will bury my sons if I haven't heard such a distinction, Kelu. I think it's essentially the equivalent, a dramatic equivalent to I could have sworn that I heard a distinction between kabolas hadam and zrikas hadam. Because after all, up until now, we're just lumping all the avodas together. Shchita, kabbalah, halacha, zrika. Is there a distinction between any of them? So it says, Reb Tarfon, I could have sworn that I have heard a distinction between kabolas hadam and zrikas hadam. Ve'enli lefarish, but I can't for the life of me recall that distinction. Rabbi Kiva says, Rabbi Kiva, and yeah, farish. I got you. I got you covered. Kabbalah lo osa ba machshava kimaise. That's the key right there. The Bryce is going to continue for a few more lines, but that's the kicker right there. That one of Rabbi Kiva is going to list a few distinctions between kabolas hadam and zrikas hadam. The first listed is that by kabolas hadam, machshava is not kimaise. What we want to assume that means is that there's no, by kabolas hadam, there's no machsheves shelo lishmah, there's no machsheves pigul, right? If by kabolas hadam, we're going to have to explain exactly what it means. But somehow, some kind of machshava of chutz lizmana, without getting into details, but somehow, when it comes to kabolas hadam, something to do with doing something outside of its proper time, by a korbin, in the kind of, because, why am I being kind of vague? Well, there's two options for what this can mean. One option would be that you're doing kabolas by pigul. What's pigul? Well, I guess I'll kind of explain in explaining the options here. One option is that you do kabolas hadam with the intention of, let's say, eating the korbin. We're talking about a korbin chatas. So with the intention of eating the korbin chatas the next day, which is already beyond the time that you're allowed to eat it. That's one option for pigul, right? That during the kabolas hadam, you have intention to eat the korbin after the time that you're allowed to eat it. Another option for pigul is that you do the shchita with the intention to do the kabolas hadam at some later date. Now that, if you're wondering, wait, that's not pigul. Okay, that's why I was kind of vague, because we're going to get into the details of what exactly we're talking about. And we're also going to get some nice definitions of pigul. But for now, the Brisa simply says that when it comes to kabolas hadam, lo asa ba machshava kimaise. Machshava is not kimaise, whether that means an improper thought with regard to shelo lishmah or pigul. By kabolas hadam, there's not going to be any issues there. It's not shaykh. By kabolas hadam, any kind of inappropriate, let's say, thoughts, whether lo lishmah, whether chutz lizmanu, not going to make a difference by kabolas hadam. Whereas zrika, also by machshava k'maisa, but by zrika, there is machshava k'maisa. These thoughts are relevant. Kiblu b'chutz einu chayiv kares. If one does kabolas hadam outside of the azara, you won't be chayiv kares. But zarko b'chutz onush kares. If you do zrikas hadam outside of the azara, so then you will be chayiv kares. Kiblu psulin ein chayavin olav. If psulin, I don't know, azar, balmum, somebody who's not allowed to do kabolas hadam, does kabolas hadam, there will be no chiyuv kares. Zarku psulin chayavin olav. But if somebody who's possible does zrikas hadam, so then it will be chayav kares. So we just saw, Rabbi Kiva offered three distinctions between kabolas hadam and zrikas hadam. One with regard to having improper thoughts, right? Lishmah, pigul. And then in terms of being chayiv kares for doing avoda outside of its bachutz, outside of where you're allowed to. And the third one related to if it's been done by a psul, being chayiv kares. Amar Reb Tarfon responds to Reb Akiva, wow, Reb Tarfon is floored. Ha'avoida emitisa yomin usmol. You did not stray right or left. You hit the nail on the head. Ani shamaiti ve'li lefarish. I had heard these distinctions and I could not for the life of me remember them. Atadoresh umaskim l'shmua b'loshon hazeh. And you hit the nail on the head. You darshan, then you got it precisely. Oh my Lord. And Reb Tarfon says to Reb Akiva, kol ha'porish mimcha ki porish michayev. Anybody who distances, who separates themselves from you, is separating themselves from life itself. Wow. Okay. So Chaver, bringing it back together. What's the shaila? The shaila is, in our Mishnah, we had said that a machshava of shelo lishmah by kabolas hadam, well, by shchita, kabola, halacha, zrika, so by kabolas hadam, machshava shelo lishmah will passel the korbin chatas or the korbin pesach. And yet we have this brayso where Rabbi Akiva is saying that a distinction between kabolas hadam and zrika hadam is that by kabolas hadam lo also ba machshava k'maisa. And we wanted to assume that what that means is that a machshava of shelo lishma or a pigul by kabolas hadam is not going to ruin the korbin. So is it going to ruin the korbin? Is it going to passel the korbin like our Mishnah says? Or not, like the Brisa says? Chaver, what do you say? Rava says, Rava likasha, no problem. Kam b'machshavas pigul, kam b'machshavas shelo lishma. So our Mishnah, so there's a distinction. Depends, are we talking about lo lishma or are we talking about pigul? Our Mishnah, which says that by kabolas hadam, a machshavas shelo lishma is going to passel the korbin, because that's talking about shelo lishma. When the Brisa talks about lo asaba machshava k'maisa, that's not talking about machshavas shelo lishma. It's talking about machshavas pigul. Okay, we're going to have to define, I'm not going to go into it again because I mentioned a few minutes ago kind of what the possibilities are that we'll have to figure out in terms of pigul, but let's just suffice it to say for now, when it comes to pigul, that will not apply to kabolas hadam. Daikanami, we can also imply this from our Mishnah, the katani zevach nifsol, the lo katani mispaga, shmamina. And we can also infer that from our Mishnah, because what does our Mishnah say? It says, Shazevach nifsol barba advarim, b'shchita v'kibel v'hiluch v'zrika. Our Mishnah says that a zevach is puzzle by this four avodis. It's not saying it becomes nispagel. It's not saying it becomes pigul, it becomes puzzle. We're talking about shelo lishma in our Mishnah. When the Brisa talks about lo asa machshava k'maisa by kabolas hadam, that's talking about pigul. Our Mishnah is talking about shelo lishma. Rabbi Akiva's Brisa is talking about pigul. Okay, so now we kind of move into this kind of next section of the daf where we're going to now be talking about pigul a bit and starting to define pigul a bit, which is interesting and important because pigul is an important sugya for Masechta Zevachim. So here we go. We're going to be kind of massaging pigul a bit. Machshavas pigul lo pasa b'kabola. So 1 second. So we had said that when Rabbi Akiva says that by kabola lo asa ba machshava kimaise, we said it means that by kabolas hadam machshavas pigul is not going to make a difference by kabolas hadam. But is that really so? Is that really true? Because let's get like a little refresher, right? There's no big chidushim over here. There's no secrets being spilled over here. We already knew from the introduction to Masechta Zevachim already that how does pigul work? And there's, you know what? I actually am gonna spill a secret. I'm gonna give a spoiler. If you actually flip the page to Yud Gimel Amud Beis in Rashi, on the 4th line of Rashi, the last wide line of Rashi, Rashi says something great. He says, Klala de Milsa. The rule is Ba'inun machshava b'shas avoda al dvar achilas adam o mizbeach. That is a beautiful, concise description of Pigul. Again, this is a description we already discussed in the introduction to Masechtas Zevachim. This is a beautiful, concise description of Pigul. Let's read it again. What Rashi says, Klal D'Milsa, the rule is ba'inun machshava b'shas avoda. Now, of course, we know that the avodas are kabolas hadam, holachas shchita, kabolas hadam, zrikas shchita, kabolas hadam, holachas hadam, zrikas hadam. I think I usually get it right. I don't know why I'm struggling with it. But those are the avodas that you need by any of the avodas. Shchita, kabbalah, holacha, zrika. The machshava of I'm going to, well, machshava what? Al tvar achilas adam o lamizbeach. A thought during shchita, kabbalah, holacha, zrika about either eating, you yourself eating, or the mizbeach eating. So what does you yourself eating look like? Well, eating the meat of the korbin. What does the mizbeach eating look like? Well, either burning the emurim on the mizbeach or even zrikas hadam, right? Throwing the blood on the mizbeach is also considered a consumption of the mizbeach. So the definition of pigul is having an improper thought during either shchita, kabbalah, holacha, zrika about the consumption of either humans or of the mizbeach. So now, right, and the consumption of humans, so either eating the animal, right, eating the korbin, or burning the emurin on the mizbeach, or zrikas hadam. Those are sort of these what you're having an improper thought about. So now, going back to Yud Gimel and Aleph, where we are, so the Gemara says, "Umachshavas pigul lo paslu b'kabbalah." What do you mean that there's no machshavas pigul when it comes to kabolas hadam? We just said that pigul is defined as an improper thought during either shchita, kabbalah, holacha, or zrika. So if when the kohen is doing kabolas hadam, he's doing kabolas hadam with the intention of eating the korbin. If we're talking about a korbin chatas, so let's say eating it tomorrow, which is too late. So of course that's going to be pigul. So what do you mean that there's no machshavas pigul when it comes to kabolas hadam? So what it's going to have to mean is that, well, again, remember that the inappropriate thought is about the achilas adam or mizbeach. Now, kabolas hadam is neither one of those. Kabolas hadam is not the consumption of a person or the mizbeach. So what it means is that if, let's say, when doing shchita, if Aharon is slaughtering Ruvain's korbin chatas with the intention of doing zrika, of doing kabolas hadam, right? So he's slaughtering, he's doing shchita with the intention of doing kabolas hadam, chutz lizmano, that is not pigul, since kabolas hadam is not achilas adam or mizbeach. Beautiful definition. So now with kind of that information, we'll have everything we need to be able to work through this Gemara right now. So umachsheves pigul lo pasla b'kabbalah. Really? Pigul is, there's no such thing as machsheves pigul by kabolas hadam b'otan. We learn in the brayso yachol lo tehei machshava mo'eles ela b'zrika b'lvad. Is it possible that machsheves pigul is only going to be shaykh to zrikas hadam? Minayin the rabbos shchita v'kabbalah. How do we know to also include that if you have machsheves pigul by shchita or by kabbalah or also by holacha, which usually goes together with kabbalah? Tamloma ve'im he'achol ye'achol, if it will surely be eaten mibsai zevach shlomo bayom hashlishi lo yerotza b'dvar ma'maviin lidei achila kosuv medaber. That the pasuk by pigul is talking about things that allow, that are matir, that allow the eating. And that would be the four avodas hadams, shchita, kabbalah, holacha, zrika. So therefore, if there is a machsheves pigul by any of the four avodas hadams, so then it will be pigul. Yochel shani marba'af shvichas shirayim v'aktoras emurin. Is it possible that I will also include here shvichas shirayim and aktoras emurin? it's interesting. We're like lumping everything together. It's fun. The Gemara right now is just like lumping everything together. Like again, there's a distinction, and that's what's important here. Is there is a distinction between if we're talking about the avodas, where you're having the machshava, or if you're talking about the achilas adam o mizbeach, right? Are you talking about the machshava, or are you talking about what the machshava is about? Right now, the Gemara is just lumping everything together. The Gemara is saying there's no pigul when it comes to Kabbalah. What do you mean there's no pigul when it comes to Kabbalah? Are we talking about the machshava, or are we talking about what the machshava is about? If we're talking about the machshava, there sure is pigul by kabolas hadam. If we're talking about what the machshava is about, yeah, if it's about kabolas hadam, no, there's no machshava pigul about kabolas hadam. Now we're also just like lumping in also haktaras emurin, shvichas dam on the yisod of the mizbeach. Again, are we talking about having improper thoughts? Yeah, there's no improper thoughts by haktaras emurin or shvichas damim. But if we're talking about what the thoughts are about, well, sure, it could be by shvichas adam and haktaras emurin. So, anyways, so the point I'm making is that it's important for us when we're talking about each of these steps, and we're saying, is there pigul or isn't there pigul? We also have to say to ourselves, well, are we talking about pigul in terms of the thought that you're having, or pigul in terms of having the thought about this thing? So, is it possible that I will also include shvichas shirayim, that the leftover, the blood after the zrikas hadam, would be spilled on the yesod hamizbeach? The yesod hamizbeach is at the bottom. I'm sure we'll get to diagrams of the mizbeach, I'm sure, pretty soon, I imagine. But basically at the bottom of the mizbeach, there was something called the yesod, which was like a protrusion at the bottom of the mizbeach. I'm sure that we'll get to a diagram of the mizbeach soon enough. And you would basically, there were holes in the yesod, and you would pour the remaining blood into the yesod, into those holes on the yesod mizbeach. But anyways, so that's considered like a type of achilas mizbeach, right? So is it possible that I'll include shvichas shirayim, the spilling of the leftover blood, haktaras emurim, or the burning of the emurim? Now again, so one second. So tamlom bayom hashlishi lo yirotze amakriv also lo yichoshev zrika bichlal oiso. Right. So zrika, right? Lo yirotze is referring to zrika sadam. So when it says so, right, so zrika bichlal, so zrika was initially considered, right, together with. What is that? Okay, so zrika was sort of included with the rest of the things that are matter the animal to be eaten. Shchita, kabbalah, olach, zrika. V'lama yotze. So how come we then single it out when we say lo yirotze? L'hakish eleo, to compare to it. Lo malach to say to you, mazrika miyuchedes she'avoda u'makeves kapara. Just like zrika is unique in that it's in avoda that is me'akev kapara. You can't have the kapara without the zrika. Av kol avoda u'makeves kapara. We're dafka talking about avodas that are me'akev kapara. Shchita, kabbalah, olach, zrika. Yosu shvichas shirayim, to the exclusion of pouring of the leftover blood after the zrikas hadam, whatever blood is remaining, pouring that onto the yisod mizbeach, haktaras emurin, and burning the emurim she'ein ma'akvin es kapara, that they are not ma'akiv kapara. Technically, if you don't spill the remaining blood on the yisod mizbeach, or you don't burn the emurim, you could still get kapara, right? As long as you do zrikas hadam, you'll get kapara. So now, okay, but remember again. So we just said that by shvichas shirayim and haktaras emurim, there's no pigul. Again, there's no pigul in terms of having a thought while you're doing shvichas shirayim or haktaras emurim. But because they are achilas mizbeach, of course, if you, let's say, are doing shchita with the kavana of doing shvichas shirayim or haktaras emurim chutz lizmano, that will be an issue, right? If you have a machshava about these things, because they're achilas mizbeach, as we are going to say in a minute, but I just kind of want to be drawing these distinctions as we're getting to each thing to make it clear that we have to be thinking about in what stage are they or are they not pigul. So Ela Lokasha Hada Omar Arini Sotnu. So meaning we had said back by Rabbi Akiva, we had said that lo also machshava kimaise by kabolas hadam, and we're saying that there's no pigul by kabolas hadam. Yet at the same time, we also said that Rebbe Vamenayin the Rabbo Shchita v'Kabbalah, right? So we said that also we include Shchita and Kabbalah, right? Shchita and kabolas hadam by Pigul. So on the one hand, we're saying that Pigul is not shaykh to kabolas hadam. On the other hand, we're saying Pigul is shaykh to kabolas hadam. So the answer is going to be the distinction that we've been discussing for the past few minutes. Lo kasha hadam hareini shochet al minas likabel dam lemacher. That's not Pigul, of course, right? If he's doing shchita with the intention and he's having a thought while he does shchita, and the thought is about that he's going to do kabolas hadam tomorrow, yeah, that's not going to be Pigul, because the thought needs to be about achilas adam or achilas mizbeach. Kabolas hadam is neither of those things. So having a thought about kabolas hadam is not Pigul. But if he's having a thought during kabolas hadam that he's going to pour the shirayim, whatever the leftover blood is, or whatever leftover blood there is, he's going to pour that on the yisod mizbeach tomorrow. That's achilas mizbeach. So that is going to be Pigul. So again, so this distinction by kabolas hadam, it depends. Are you having the thought during kabolas hadam, or is the thought about kabolas hadam? If the thought is during kabolas hadam, so it's Pigul. If the thought is about kabolas hadam, it's not Pigul. A certain rabbi said to Ravu, Shvichas shirayim b'aktaras emurim lo paslu b'machshava. Again, this gets back to the distinction that I had pointed out a few minutes ago, that we had said earlier, is it possible that Pigul would apply to Shvichas shirayim and aktaras emurim? We say no, it has to be things that are ma'akev, not Shvichas shirayim and aktaras emurim. But again, it depends. Are we talking about having a thought during Shvichas shirayim or aktaras emurim? Or are we talking about a thought about Shvichas shirayim b'aktaras emurim? So again, Shvichas shirayim b'aktaras emurim lo paslu machshava ve'ha tanya. We learn in a b'raisa yachol lo tehei machshava mo'eles elo b'achilas basar. Is it possible that a machshava, in this case we're talking about achilas basar, is it possible that a machshava of Pigul is limited to being about eating the korbin alone? How do I know that even if the thought is about burning the emurim on the mizbeach or pouring the shirayim on the yisod mizbeach? How do we know that if the thought is about that, it would also be Pigul? That when the pasuk says in the context of Pigul, it's talking about two types of consuming. Like we saw earlier, this distinction that Rashi, as part of Rashi's definition, right, based on what we're saying now, that the thought of Pigul is about achilas adam, right, humans consuming outside of the proper time, or the mizbeach consuming, whether that's talking about the emurim, haktaras emurim, whether it's talking about zrikas hadam, whether it's talking about shvichas shirayim. These are all examples of achilas mizbeach, and a thought about any of these things, zrikas hadam, shvichas shirayim, haktaras emurim, would be Pigul. So lokasha the Omar Arini Zorek Amanas Lishfoch Shirayim Limacher. If a person says I'm doing Zrik, or if a kohen says I'm doing Zrikas hadam with the intention that I'm going to do Lishpoch Shirayim Limacher, that's going to be a problem, because that's Achilas Mizbeach. He's having a thought about Achilas Mizbeach. That would be Pigul. Hada Omar Arini Shofech Shirayim Amanas Dakte Mur Limacher. But if he says I am pouring the Shirayim on the Yisod Mizbeach, and he has a thought while he's pouring the shirayim in order to burn the emurim the next day, that won't be Pigul, because the thought needs to be during one of the avodas, shchita, kabbalah, olacha, zrika, not during shvichas shirayim, which is achilas mizbeach. The thought has to be about achilas mizbeach, not during the achilas mizbeach. And now we begin the third section of today's daf, dipping a finger in the blood of a korbin chatas and how that relates to Pigul. Okay, awesome. Okay, here's the dealio. So when it comes to korbin chatas, okay, so unlike most korbanos where you have zrikas hadam. You take the blood, right? So you slaughter the animal, and then you put this vessel, this bowl of sorts, I guess a bowl, underneath the neck of the animal, and the blood, and the animal bleeds out into the bowl, and you take the bowl over to the mizbeach, and you throw the blood against the walls of the mizbeach. By korbin chatas, it's a little bit different. You take your finger, the kohen takes his finger, and mamash sticks his finger into the blood, and then he touches his finger to the corners of the mizbeach. Of course, at the top of the mizbeach, there were those kind of like horns, the karnos on mizbeach. They kind of one amma, I think it was one amma cubed at the top, and he would touch I think it's taka machlokas. I think we even saw it recently about if he davka touches the karnos mizbeach or just anywhere above the chuta sikra. But anyways, that's done manually. Now, in Masechta Horius, we learned all about the Parlim Davashal Tzibur, the Par Kohen Mashiach. Both of those are what's called chatos apnimios. Those are korbin chatases that are slaughtered in the Azara. Tomorrow we're gonna have some diagrams of the Beis Hamikdash. Tomorrow we're really gonna have to have a look at what things look like. I didn't have diagrams today. Yeah, I don't think we need them today. Tomorrow there's gonna be diagrams. So basically the korbin chatas the chatas apnimios, they are slaughtered in the Azara. Again, tomorrow we'll have diagrams. We'll see exactly where everything is, but it's slaughtered in Azar. And then the blood is taken into the heichal, and there also, the pasuk says that the kohen will stick his finger into the blood, and then sprinkle in front of the paroches in the kodesh, in the heichal, and also then touch the blood to the karnos of the mizbeach apnimi, the mizbeach hakatoris, the mizbeach azov. So by korbin chatas, the kohen actually sticks his hands into the blood itself, and the question is going to be: this sticking of the hands into the blood. What if while he's sticking his hands into the blood, he has a machshavas pigul? He has a machshava to eat the korbin tomorrow, right? Can the tvilas etzba be mefagel? That's going to be the main question that we will be discussing now. Says the Gemara, Amr Yehuda Breder Reb Chia. So Reb Chia, I believe, had two sons, Chizkiah and Yehuda. So it says Reb Yehuda Breder Reb Chia, Shamaiti, I heard, Shetvilas etzba mifageles chatos pnimis. Okay, so by chatos pnimis, for example, Par Kohen Mashiach that we learned all about in Masechta Horius, Parlim Davashal Tzibur, both are chatos apnimios, as I was discussing a few minutes ago. So Rabbi Yehuda Breder Reb Chia says, I heard shetfilas etzba mifageles b'chatos pnimios. So now there is a distinction between mifageles and mispageles, which is essentially the distinction that we've been talking about for the past 15, 20 minutes or so, right? Are we talking about having the thought or what the thought is about? Mifageles is having the thought, right? So it says Rabbi Yehuda Breder Reb Chia that I heard that Tfilas Etzba is mifageles, i.e., that just like by Shrita, Kabbalah, Olacha, Zrika, if while doing those activities you have a machshava of achilas mizbeach outside of the proper time, right? Whether we're talking about, let's say, eating the korbin, let's say, right? Achilas adam, achilas mizbeach, whether eating the korbin, aktar semurin, etc. So it says Rabbi Yehuda that I heard that just like by Shrita, Kabbalah, Olacha, Zrika, also by Tvilas Etzba, by Chatos Apnimios, when the kohen goes into the heichal and sticks his finger into the blood and then sprinkle, and then he then kind of trickles some blood in front of the paroches and then touches the blood to the mizbach aktoris, the mizbech hazav. So if while doing the dipping of his finger, he has some kind of machshava of chutz lizmano, So that would be Pigul. So Rabbi Yehuda Brei, the Bechia Shamaiti, I heard Shetvilas Etzba, that the dipping of the finger mifageles can create a situation of Pigul, right, as opposed to mispageles, which would be what the thought is about. But anyways, Bechatos pnimis, by an inner chatas. Shama Ilfa heard Rabbi Yehuda Brei the Bechia say this. Amr Kame de Bar Poda, and Ilfa said this before Bar Poda, that Tvilas Etzba is mifagel by chatas apnimis. Omar, Bar Poda says, wait a second. Kun lamadu Pigul elami shlomim. Wait a second. Pigul is learnt out from a korbin shlomim. Ma shlomim ein Tvilas Etzba mifageles bohen. Af chatos ein Tvilas Etzba mifageles bohen. And says Bar Poda, look, Pigul is be'etzem learnt out from a korbin shlomim. There's no Tvilas Etzba by korbin shlomim. That's something that's unique to chatos. Chatas pnimis, but also chatas hachitzonis as well, because by chatas the kohen would dip his finger into the blood and then apply it to the karnos hamizbeach. So, says Bar Poda, look, Pigul is learnt out from a korbin shlomim. By korbin shlomim, there is no Tvilas Etzba. And since there's no Tvilas Etzba by korbin shlomim, so it means that there's no Tvilas Etzba bichlal by Pigul, even by a chatos ha-pnimis. So again, Omar klum lamadu Pigul el mishlomim, says Bar Poda, look, we learn out Pigul from shlomim. Ma shlomim ein Tvilas Etzba mifageles behen, just like by korbin shlomim, there's no Tvilas Etzba. That's a chatas thing, and therefore Mimela Tvilas Etzba is not going to be mifagel. So af chatos ain't Tvilas Etzba mifageles bohen. So also by korbin chatos, even though there is Tvilas Etzba by korbin chatos, it's not going to be mifagel, since Pigul is learned from shlomim, and Tvilas Etzba is not shaykh to korbin shlomim. But now frek the Gemara. Wait a second. Really, did they really learn out everything from a korbin shlomim as pertains to Pigul? Ima shlomim shelo lishmon ein motzi midei Pigul, av chatas shelo lishma ein motzi midei Pigul. The Gemara asks the question. There is a concept when it comes to Pigul that in order for a korbin to be Pigul, there has to be what's called matir. What's that? A matir k'mitzvason. What? What's the thing I'm thinking of? Come on. Matir k'mitzvason. Sheyikarvu kol matir. Okay, that's fine. Sheyikarvu kol matir. Okay, what's the? Oh, kariv amatir k'mitzvaso. That's the phrase I'm thinking of. Kariv amatir k'mitzvaso. Kariv amatir k'mitzvaso. Basically, in order for something to be Pigul, all of the matirs. What are the matirs? Shchita, kabolas, holacha, zrika. So, for example, if a Haran slaughters Ruvain's korbin chatas, if a Haran slaughters Ruvain's korbin chatas, and when a Haran slaughters Ruvain's korbin chatas, he has a machshava to eat it tomorrow, which is too late. So that's Pigul. Right? That during the avoda of shchita, he had a machshava to eat the korbin outside of its allotted time. That's Pigul. But in order for it to actually, and therefore if he eats it even within the allotted time, doesn't matter, it's Pigul. If he eats it, it's chayiv kares. But in order for it to actually end up being Pigul, the kabolas, the holacha, and the zrika all have to be done kimitzvasan, all have to be done properly. If, however, an additional issue arises in the avoda, for example, by korbin chatas, as we know, it has to be lishmah. If, after doing the shchita with the intention of eating it tomorrow, he then does kabolas hadam with the intention of in Ola, which of course would make the korbin chatas puzzle, it's no longer pigul because it's lo karev amatir kimitzvason. In that case, the rest of the matirin, right after the shchita, you have kabbalah, holacha, zrika. In that case, they were not done properly. While doing kabolas hadam, there was a machshava shelo lishmah. So because that, right, and that's gonna, right, that's something that would make, right, that would be possible by korbin chatas. So therefore, it cancels the pigul. So now what the Gemara asks, so Bar Pada says it's impossible that tvilas etzba could be mifagel by a chatas apnimis. Why is it impossible? Because pigul bichlal is learned from korbin shlomim, and there's no tvilas etzba by korbin shlomim. But for the Gemara, it can't be that we exactly learn out pigul from korbin shlomim, because by a korbin shlomim, for example, machshavah shelo lishmah is kosher. Machshavah shelo lishmah by shlomim, of course, as we know from the first Mishnah in Masechta Zevachim, it's kosher. Shelo lishmah by shlomim is kosher, and therefore by korbin shlomim, if a hiren slaughters Ruvain's korbin shlomim with the intention of eating it 3 days from now, which is going to be too late, and so that would be pigul, and then he does kabolas hadam with the intention of an ola, well, the korbin's still kosher and it's still going to be pigul. But the halacha is that when it comes to a korbin chatas, if a hiren slaughters Ruvain's korbin chatas with the intention of eating it chutz lizmanu, but then does kabolas hadam shelo lishma, well, that would be lo karev amatir k'mitzvaso, and it would not be pigul. Now, if we're saying that pigul is learned out from shlomim and everything has to be based on shlomim, well, then I would say that since shelo lishma is kosher by shlomim, well, then shelo lishma will not cancel the pigul by a korbin chatas either. But yet we know that it does. So clearly, it's not simply that pigul is being derived from shlomim. So again, is it really so that all halachos of pigul are learned out from shlomim? If that were the case, then I would come to the conclusion that, well, just like by korbin shlomim, right? If by korbin shlomim, after Aharon slaughtered Ruvain's korbin shlomim with the intention of eating it in 3 days from now, he then, during the kabolas hadam, I don't know if he's doing it or somebody else is doing it, but by the kabolas hadam, there's then a machshava of shelo lishma, ein motzi midei pigul. That won't undo, that won't cancel the pigul, since machshava shelo lishma by shlomim is kosher. And yet, but if that were the case, and we're saying that we learn all ilchos pigul from shlomim, I would come to the conclusion that af chatas, that I would say the same thing then by korbin chatas. That if Aharon slaughtered Ruvain's korbin chatas with the intention of eating it outside of its allotted time, which is pigul, but then shelo lishma, then during the kabolas hadam there was a machshavas shelo lishma, I would say ein motzi midei pigul. Just like by shlomim, it's not motzi midei pigul. So by chatas, it's also not motzi midei pigul, but that's not true, since by korbin chatas shelo lishma is going to passel the korbin, and therefore cancel the pigul. So what do you have to say? Meribuya dekroi ka'asya, hachinami meribuya dekroi ka'asya. Rather, what you're going to have to say is that pigul is not being learnt out from shlomim. Pigul is being learnt out from some other ribuy in the pasuk. It doesn't say exactly what that ribuy is. However, it's learnt out elsewhere. It's learnt out from a different source, the halachos of pigul, and that is why if Aharon slaughters Ruvain's korbin chatas with the intention of eating it outside of its proper time, but then there's kabolas hadam shelo lishma, it will cancel the pigul, even though that's not relevant to korbin shlomim. Well, guess what? In terms of tvilas etzba being mifagel, even though that's not something that's relevant to shlomim, that doesn't matter. So here also we'll say from the ribuya dekra, we'll learn out from psukim again. It doesn't say what the kra is, as far as I'm aware. But nonetheless, we will also learn out from this ribuya dikra that tvilas etzba could be mifagel by a korbin chatas. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says the holy Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi zo, but ba'aliyah zo shamati me Rebbe, in this attic. I feel like lots of stuff happened in attics. I wonder what the sort of sociological, is that the right word? Context is like the maybe people just had more lofts and attics and stuff. What do their houses look like? Anyways. Shetvilas etzba mifageles. Okay, so it says Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi that in this attic I heard, so that I have this, right, I have something that adds me Rebbe, from Rebbe. Okay, take it or leave it. Okay, we could leave it since it's not in the text. I don't think it matters. So I'm Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, says Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, but Aliyah zo shamati, that in this attic I heard that Tvilas etzba is mifageles, by korbin chatas, when the kohen sticks his fingers into the blood. If he has a machshava of chutz lizmano, it will create pigul toiba. Reb Shimon ben Lakish. Berish Lakish asks the familiar question: Klum lamdu pigul el mishlamim? But pigul is learnt out from korbin shlamim. Mashlamim ein tvilas etzba mifageles, and since, of course, by korbin shlamim, there's no concept of tvilas etzba, saf chatos ein tvilas etzba mifageles boin. So also by korbin chatos, even though there is tvilas etzba by korbin chatos, but it won't be mifagel since pigul is derived from shlamim and there's no tvilas etzba by shlamim. One second, do we learn out all ilchos pigul from shlamim? Shlamim shelo lishmah ein motzi midei pigul. The same question that we asked earlier, that when it comes to korbin shlamim, if it's pigul, if then you have machshavas shelo lishmah, since machshavas shelo lishmah by shlamim is kosher, it won't cancel the pigul, as we explained earlier. Af chatos shelo lishmah ein motzi midei pigul. But if that's the case, then we would draw the conclusion that the same would be the case if everything's learned out from pigul. So then we would say, if everything's learned out from shlamim, so then we would say that by a korbin chatos, if the korbin chatas is pigul, and then you have machshavas shelo lishmah, and by chatas shelo lishmah is pasul, yet we would draw the conclusion that it would not cancel the pigul. But we know that that's not true. So it must be that chatas, right? It must be that we're not learning out all of the halachos of pigul from shlamim. Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina, says Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina, in hakol mishlamim lamdu. So says Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina, listen, it is all learnt from korbin shlamim. Okay, fine, givaldik. So if it's all learned from korbin shlamim, so then how do we explain the phenomenon by korbin chatas? How then, by korbin chatas, is machshavas shelo lishmah going to cancel the pigul? Shelo lishmah, after all, is kosher by shlamim, as we've been saying. Hoil v'chutz limkomo posel b'shlamim, and the answer is, well, since by korbin shlamim, okay, so if you have a korbin shlamim, aharon, slaughtered Reuven's korbin shlamim, with the intention of eating it outside of its proper time, and then he did kabolas hadam, then there was kabolas hadam with the intention of burning the emurin outside of its proper place, let's say in his backyard or something. I think that makes sense. Well, then it's lo kariv amatir k'mitzvos, right? So there was a machshavas pigul by shchita, but then the kabbalah was done with the intention of chutz limkomo, which is it's not pigul. Pigul is chutz lizmano. Then there's a chiyuv kares. Chutz limkomo is going to passel the korbin, but there's no chiyuv kares. Well, then it would be shelo kariv amatir k'mitzvos. So we say that well. So in terms of pigul by chatos, pigul by shlamim, so we say, look, by a korbin shlamim, if there was machshavas pigul by the shchita, and then by, let's say, the Kabbalah, there was a machshav of chutz limkomo, so that would cancel the pigul. Okay? So whole the chutz limkomo posel b'shlam, since chutz limkomo is something that's posel by korbin shlam, even outside of the context of pigul, but a machshavas chutz limkomo is posel by shlam. V'shelo lishmo posel b'chatas, and a kavana of lo lishmah is going to be posel by a korbin chatas. Well, ma chutz limkomo ha-posel b'shlam motzi midei pigul. So just like a machshavas chutz limkomo, which generally speaking is going to posel a korbin shlomim, and we say that then when there's a scenario of pigul, a machshavas chutz limkomo will cancel the pigul. So shelo lishmo aposel b'chatos. So also a machshavas shelo lishmo by a korbin chatas, which generally speaking will posel the korbin. Motzia midei pigul. If we're talking about a chatas that's pigul, shelo lishmo will cancel the pigul. So it says Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina, the halachas of pigul are in fact learned from shlomim, but they can be applied kind of more conceptually rather than literally. And therefore, instead of saying something like, there's no tvilas etzba by shlomim, therefore the tvilas etzba can't be mefagel, or since shelo lishma is kosher by shlomim, it's not going to cancel pigul by a chatas. No. That would be taking the limud too literally. Take it on from a more conceptual point of view, and that is, well, if you think about it, when it comes to shlomim, that which is going to posel a korbin shlomim, for example, chutz limkomo, will cancel pigul. So let's say that when it comes to korbin chatas, something that's going to posel a korbin chatas, in the case of korbin chatas, that could be shelo lishma. It will be posel the korbin chatas, and it will cancel the pigul. Omar, Rabbi Yirmiyah, mitzida tav, says Rabbi Yirmiyah, that is not going to work. Why is that not going to work? Malchutz limkomo aposel b'shlamim shkeinoyeg b'chol ha'azvachim. Look, fundamentally, making a comparison between chutz limkomo, which is something that applies to every single korbin, and shelo lishma, which is relevant to only korbin chatas and korbin pesach, fundamentally that is going to be a flawed comparison. Because, to say that chutz limkomo, which is possible by shlomim, but which is also possible by every korbin, can then cancel pigul, that does not automatically mean that shelo lishma, which only is possible by chatas and korbin pesach, I wouldn't now come and conclude that that's going to cancel pigul. So Rabbi Yirmiyah says, Rabbi Yirmiyah mitzida tavra, that's a broken comparison. Malachutz limkomo aposel b'shlamim. Look, chutz limkomo, which is possible by korbin shlamim and which cancels pigul. Shekin noyeg b'chol ha'azvachim. Chutz limkomo is something that's relevant to all korbanos. Tomer b'shalo lishmo she'enu noyeg ela b'pesach v'chatas b'vad. You're now going to apply that principle to shelo lishma, which is something that's only possible by two korbanos, by chatas and korbin pesach. Elo ma'islach lemeimar. So rather, what are you going to say? Okay, here's what you could say. We can still learn out the halachas of pigul from shlomim. That's fine, but we need to kind of abstract the comparison even one step further. Right? We already kind of said, like, don't take the comparison too literally, but even so that we didn't quite abstract it quite enough, because we were getting into specifics and into details. We were talking about chutz limkomo and shelo lishmah, which invited scrutiny of like, well, chutz l'mkomo and shelo lishmah are two different. Chutz l'mkomo is everywhere. Shelo lishmah is only in two places. Let's even abstract it one level further. Dovra posel bohen motziam midei pigul. The concept is that which is posel bohem, and whatever it is for them, is motzi midei pigul. So in the case of shlomim, that could be chutz l'mkomo, and it's also going to cancel pigul. Dovra ma'akev bohen meviim midei pigul, and things that are ma'akev create a scenario of pigul. For example, shchita, kabolas, holacha, zrika, having machsheves, shelo chutz zmano, during any of those avodas is going to create pigul. So Achonami will say the same thing by a korbin chatas, davra posel ba motzi midei pigul. So whatever is going to make it posel, and if in the case of chatas that means shelo lishmah, okay, so that could also be motzi midei pigul. It can cancel out a scenario of pigul, right? So if Aharon slaughtered Reuven's korbin chatas with the intention to eat it outside of its proper time, but then the kabolas hadam was done shelo lishmah. So since shelo lishmah is possible by korbin chatas, so it'll cancel the pigul. And also davar ma'akev ba, something that is ma'akev, for example, tvilas etzba mevia lidei pigul, will create a scenario of pigul. That if there is machsheves chutz lizmano during the tvilas etzba, to let's say eat the korbin outside of its proper time, so then it will create a scenario of pigul. If we're talking about a chatas chitzonis, let's say, which is eaten. Amar of Mari says of Mari, we also have a mishnah to support the notion that tfilas etzba is mitfagel ze'aklal. This is the rule by mit nochis kol akometz v'nosim b'chli ve'amolech ve'amaktir, that all of these things, I think the point is they can make pigul. So now, I think that we've mentioned this before, that by a korbin mincha, the kmitza, nesina b'kli, holacha, and haktara align with the shchita, kabbalah, holacha, zrika of a zevach. So just like by shchita, kabbalah, holacha, zrika, by a zevach, all of these things can be mifagel. So also by menacha, kmitza, kabbalah, nesina b'kli, holacha, haktara, each one of those avodas can be mifagel. So it says, so Amar of Mari says of Mari, afon and amitin, and we all could learn in a mishnah. This is all kol kometz, right? If you take the kometz, that's like shchita. V'nosim b'kli, putting it in a vessel, that's like kabolas hadam. Ve'amolich, and bringing the, I believe in the case of a mincha, because I believe that this is already happening next to the mizbeach. If I'm not mistaken, basically what happens is you take I think we've gone through this. You take a vessel, you put some oil in the vessel, then you put some flour there, then you put some more oil. Then I think you mix it together a bit, and then you put it into another vessel, and then you finish adding like oil and stuff, and then you bring that to, I think, next to the mizbeach, and then the kohen there takes the kometz from it, puts it in another vessel. I think he's then walking that vessel, I think maybe to the top of the mizbeach, where he's then going to burn it on the top of the mizbeach. But anyways, so the holacha of the mincha is like the holacha of the dam, and then ve'amaktir, burning the mincha, is like the zrikas hadam, right? Taking the kometz and burning the kometz is like the zrikas hadam. Now, bishlama kometz anu shochet. Okay, so we're saying separating the fistful is like shchita, molech anu molech, and walking the mincha to, I think, the top of the mizbeach is like walking the blood to the side of the mizbeach. Maktinami anu zorek, and burning the kometz is like zrikas hadam. Elet no saint b'chli my new, but what is the parallel when it comes to taking the kometz and putting it in a vessel. Kometz, of course, being the fistful of flour. If we're going to say, well, it's like kabolas hadam, right? Kabolas hadam is received in a vessel, and here you're taking the fistful and you're putting it in a vessel. But midami, can you really say that they are analogous? By kabolas hadam, the blood is on its own draining, bleeding out into the vessel. Whereas over here, you are taking the fistful and putting it in the vessel. So answers the Gemara, came de lo sagi de lo yoiv al korche avoda chshuvahi. But here's the thing. The reason why so even though nesina bekli is fundamentally different, or so we want to argue for now, that nesina bekli, placing the fistful into the vessel, is fundamentally different than receiving the blood of the animal into the vessel, because receiving happens automatically, placing you actually have to do. Even though they're fundamentally different, nonetheless, placing the fistful in the kli is significant, is an important part of the korbin mincha. So hachinami, also when it comes to tvilas etzba, since it's a crucial part of the korbin chatas, we'll consider that to be holacha, like bringing the blood closer to where it needs to go, whether, I guess, by the paroches or in the mizbach hakatoris. And therefore we'll consider tvilas etzba to be a form of holacha, and that's why we'll say that tvilas etzba can be mifagel. Just like nesina bekli by a mincha is mifagel, so also tvilas etzba by a korbin chatas is mifagel. No. Lo dummy the kabola. No. We wanted to say that kabolas hadam is fundamentally different than nesinas akometz b'kli, because one's automatic, one you have to actually do, and therefore because we said that they're fundamentally different, but the reason why there's pigul by nesina b'kli is because it's important, and if we want to say that tvilas kli is also, tvilas etzba is also important, no. Actually, nesina b'kli is analogous to kabolas hadam in both scenarios, right? Whether it's the blood that's coming from the animal is ending up in a vessel, or whether it's the fistful of flour that's coming from the rest of the flour that's ending up in a kli. The point is, by the shchita, you have the shchita, and then the blood drains into a vessel. By the mincha, you have the kmitza, and then that kometz ends up in a vessel. That is both going to be the same step, the same Kabbalah step. Right, the olam dedami le Kabbalah, nesina b'kli is analogous to kabolas hadam. And if you can say, what do you mean? But they're fundamentally different. By kabolas hadam, it's automatic. By nesina b'kli, it's he has to do it. Came the idi matan kli hu mali memela mali koshok v'yoyed. But look, at the end of the day, we're talking about sort of this content of sorts, right? This content of the korbin ending up in a kli sharis, and that is shared by both scenarios. By after the shchita, the blood draining into the kli, ultimately the blood ending up in a kli sharis, and here after taking the kometz, the flour ending up in a kli sharis. That is both the same step, and that's going to be kabolas, whether it's kabolas hadam or that would be analogous by a mincha. But we wouldn't necessarily be able to draw that then to tvilas etzba. So to say that we have a raya from this Mishnah in Menachis for tvilas etzba, the Gemara says that would be a stretch. Now to wrap up the daf, lema ke tanoi. Let us say that it's a machlokas tanoim, that whether tvilas etzba should be considered holacha or not when it comes to korbin chatas, dipping your finger in the blood, I guess as a step towards, getting the blood a step closer to where it's going to be sprinkled. Whether if we're talking about chatos apnimios, so I guess that would be because the chatos apnimios are, you then sprinkle the blood in front of the paroches that divides before the Kodesh HaKodashim, as well as applying the blood on the Mizbech HaZahav, which is also the Mizbech HaPnimi / the Mizbech HaKetores. Additionally, by the chatas achitzonius, by the regular korbin chatases, which are on the Mizbech HaChitzon in the Azara, so also the kohen would dip his fingers into the blood and then apply that to the Mizbech HaChitzon, to the corners of Mizbech HaChitzon. Okay, so now lema kitanoi. So let's say that whether tvilas etzba is considered holacha is a machlokas tanoim. The tanichada, because we have one brisa that says tvilas etzba mifageles bichatos. We have one brisa that says that tvilas etzba is mifagel by korbin chatas. Okay, so let's say, well, if it's mifagel, and we know that shchita, kabbalah, holacha, zrika are mifagel, so tvilas etzba is mifagel by korbin chatas, so it must be holacha. V'tanidach lo mifageles, v'lo mispageles. Another brisa says tvilas etzba is not mifagel, nor is it mispagel if you have a kavana about doing the tvilas etzba outside of its proper time. Neither of those will be pigul. So let's say that means that pigul, that tvilas etzba, is not holacha, and therefore it's not shaykh to pigul. So my love tanoi, let's say it's machlokas tanoi about whether tvilas etzba is holacha or not. No, tvilas etzba is holacha. Tvilas etzba is holacha. Everybody agrees with that. Harabon and Reb Shimon. But if you remember in our Mishnah, the opinion of Reb Shimon was that shelo lishman does not apply to holacha. Shelo lishma doesn't apply to holacha because holacha isn't an avoda that has to necessarily be done. But you could slaughter a korbin right next to the mizbeach, then you don't have to do holacha. So because holacha is something that inherently does not have to be done, so therefore shelo lishma is not shaykh, and we want to say also that pigul is also not going to be shaykh by holacha. Reb Shimon, my area tvilas etzba, but if so, that we're talking about Reb Shimon, so then why are we saying that tvilas etzba is not shaykh to pigul? Ha'amar kol she'eino mizbeach achitzon kishlamim ein bo mishum pigul. Reb Shimon's opinion is actually a lot broader than simply tvilas etzba. He actually says that any korbanos that are not offered on the mizbeh, that their blood is not thrown on the zrikas hadam, on the mizbeh hachitzon like a shlamim is, ein bo mishum pigul, it's not shaykh to pigul. So if we're talking about chatos apnimius, tvilas etzba, sure, it applies to chatos achitzonos, but also applies to chatos apnimios. And therefore, if we're talking about chatos apnimios, Reb Shimon says that pigul b'chlal doesn't apply to chatos apnimios. So this isn't about tvilas etzba be'etzem. It's about the fact that according to Reb Shimon, there's b'chlal not any pigul at all when it comes to chatos apnimios. So don't say that tvilas etzba, whether it's halachas, machlokas, rabbanan, and Reb Shimon. Reb Shimon b'chlal doesn't hold of tvilas etzba because he doesn't hold of pigul b'chlal by chatos apnimios. So elo ava rabbanan. Okay, so rather both brises are the rabbis. Both brises are the rabbis. Okay. V'lo kasha kam b'chatos achitzonis kam chatos apnimius. And the difference is by the chatos ha-chitzonius versus the chatos apnimius. When the brisa says that tvilas etzba is not mifagel, that's by chatos ha-chitzonius. And when it says that Tvilas etzba is mifagel, that's by chatos hapnimius. How come? Well, actually, friends, that the pasuk, the reason why we've been kind of mentioning chatos hapnimius more specifically than chatos hachitzonos is because if we look at the pasuk by chatos hapnimius, specifically by the par koin Mashiach, what does it say? It says the taval hakoin is bo badam v'hiza v'nadam shemvam, etc. By the chatos pnimios, it specifically says v'taval. By the chatos achitzonius, it doesn't actually specifically, explicitly say v'taval. What it says by the chatos achitzonius is v'lokach. It says v'lokach hakoin midam chatas. The chatos hachitzonius is v'lokach hakoin midam chatas, that the kohen takes from the dam achatas, but he doesn't say that he specifically dips his finger into the dam achatas. And right, v'lokach, I think we say specifically even kabola, right? V'lokach hakoin midam achatas be'ezbo v'ei lekicha kabolahi. I'm reading Rashi. We know yalfin and kabola, right? Exactly. So because by chatos hachitzonius it doesn't explicitly say tvilas etzba, so therefore there's not going to be pigul by tvilas etzba by chatos hachitzonius. But by chatos pnimios, where it does specifically say tvilas etzba, so there will be pigul by tvilas etzba. Okay, so it says the Gemara, chatos hachitzonius pshita lo ksibbu v'tova. Well, of course, by chatos hachitzonius there's no pigul by tvilas etzba. It doesn't say anything about tvilas etzba in the psukim. No, I still need to make this distinction because I may have thought to say yes. Even the fact of the matter is, the halacha is that even though it doesn't explicitly say v'taval by chatos hachitzonius, the fact of the matter is, the halacha is that the kohen must dip his finger into the blood. Even though it doesn't say it explicitly, the halacha is that he must dip his finger into the blood. That he takes the blood, and Rashi says the mashma hu ba'atzmi yikach, which implies that he himself will take it from the blood. V'i asi kof remilahu, and if a monkey comes and places, right, the monkey sticks his fingers into the blood and places the blood on the fingers of the kohen, and the kohen didn't himself stick his fingers in the blood, ayode, and the monkey puts it on his hands, but in the mishkol zimnach, we say that would not be okay. The kohen himself would have to dip his hands in the blood. So command v'tav adam. So, for all intents and purposes, yeah, I know that it doesn't explicitly say v'tavo by chatos hachitzonius, but the fact of the matter is, the halacha is he does have to dip his hands into the blood. So I might think that since the fact of the matter is he does have to dip his hands into the blood, so tvilas etzba should be mefagel even by chatos hachitzonius. Komash malon lachi lo ksiv v'taval mash machi umash machi. But this is why the pasuk does not specifically say v'taval by chatos hachitzonius, because v'taval teaches two things. If it were to say v'taval, it would teach, yes, he has to dip his fingers into the blood, but also that there's pigul by tvilas etzba. The Torah explicitly does not say v'taval by chatos hachitzonius because it wanted to exclude chatos hachitzonius from pigul by tvilas etzba. So therefore, the halacha is according to the Chachamim that when it comes to chatos hachitzonius, there is no pigul by tvilas etzba, and when it comes to chatos pnimios, there is pigul by tvilas etzba. Friends, that was Daf Yud Daled of Masechta. No, that was Daf Yud Gimel of Masechta Zevachim. A pretty important daf. We learned about some pretty important stuff, right? We learned the Mishnah that extended, really started talking more about kabolas hadam, olachas hadam, zrikas hadam. We learned about lo lishmah during kabolas hadam, having machshava of shelo lishmah during kabolas hadam. We defined pigul a bit, improper thought during one of the avodas regarding the consumption of either a person or the mizbeach. That was an important definition by Rashi of pigul. And then we discussed dipping a finger in the blood of a korbin chatas, and how that relates to Pigul. It can be Pigul for inner korbanos, and it cannot be Pigul for outer korbanos. That was a very big, long daf where we really went into depth to learn out these halachas, which we kind of distilled them into a few bullets, but there was kind of a big limud to kind of learn out these halachas. Friends, I hope you enjoyed learning Daf Yud Gimel and learning about Pigul and different machshavas. Peace.